If Sola Scriptura is true, then Protestants should have a reliable and principled method for identifying which books are Scripture without appealing to any outside infallible authority. Why is that? Well, in order to claim Scripture alone is infallible, we have to know what Scripture refers to. And to know what Scripture refers to, we need a reliable method for determining what belongs in Scripture.
Correct. A reliable method. Using Cameron's own definition, we must have a reliable method. It doesn't have to be an infallible method. It can be a reliable method. And what is that method? Well, when you study the canon of Scripture and the composition of the canon of the New Testament, you'll see that the church fathers, over the course of decades, had conversations. Some of these conversations took place over the course of decades because some of them did not have certain books that later were recognized as being divinely inspired. And others proposed that other texts were divinely inspired, when ultimately the church came to realize, no, it wasn't quite right. We can present and recognize a reliable method for the canon of Scripture. That doesn't mean it's an infallible method. Moreover, it's a red herring, because we don't need an infallible method to determine the canon of Scripture in order to support the idea that Scripture itself is infallible. We can recognize which texts are divinely inspired, and from a view of divine inspiration, that what is inspired by God is infallible, the written word is infallible, so we don't need to have an explanation of the explanation for you William Lane Craig fans out there. And that is why Bertuzzi's canon argument is a red herring. But let's continue listening nevertheless.
But as we'll see, Protestants don't have one. Every method they appeal to is actually unreliable. So let's consider the options. So some Protestants say we know a book is Scripture if it was written by an apostle or someone close to an apostle. And this one sounds promising until you realize that 1 Clement was written by someone who knew the apostles, yet it's not in the canon. Meanwhile, Hebrews somehow made the cut, even though we have no idea who wrote it. So apostolicity doesn't actually give us a consistent rule here. This method is therefore unreliable. Other Protestants say we recognize Scripture because...
So there is a way that we could respond to Cameron's concern over what we could call the criteria of canon about the apostles or someone who knew the apostles. Well, we would further enlighten this idea of someone who knew the apostles, because this person would have been writing about the context of the earliest Christians. And what Clement's writings are about the late first century Christians. There's an argument to be made. Now you might say, well, what about John the Revelator in Revelation? You could say that he was an apostle and therefore we would include it, but because we have to draw the line somewhere, one would think, in assessing what is divinely inspired, that's the line that the church fathers agreed upon. Now note here that we could still find that the decision of the church fathers was reliable, and there's no problem with that. But we're not saying that they are infallible, that they are incapable of making a mistake. So Cameron's response to the first argument doesn't address that. Let's see if he'll address it later.
Because of its internal qualities, it bears the marks of divine inspiration. Okay, but then why did early Christians disagree about books like 2 Peter, Revelation, the Shepherd of Hermas, and the Didache? If the marks of inspiration were obvious, you'd expect agreement from the start. But instead...
No one here has argued that it was obvious. Why is he saying that if it were obvious? Where are the Protestants saying that it is obvious? Maybe Cameron could pull them out of a hat. Just wondering where they are. Cameron seems to be attacking yet again a straw man. He's attacking an alleged aspect of some doctrine or some subpoint to support Sola Scriptura that no one's actually defending.
The early church argued about the canon for centuries until church authorities stepped in to make decisions. Protestants can't reliably appeal to those church decisions, though, because they reject those same authorities as being unreliable when it comes to the Old Testament, where they disagree with the Catholic canon. So what's left? You can't trust the church.
Now he's making a more complex argument. We can trust the church tradition, we can trust the church authority, and you might ask, well, why? And you could say, given the reasons that they proposed. Now, if you look at the Old Testament canon, there were other reasons given here. This is a separate category, and there was, from my research, and I could get into this next week if I must. I'd have to go back and refresh myself. From my studies, I remember learning that there was even in the church fathers, there was this separate category for the OT apocrypha, and that they weren't equivalent to the other, say, New Testament documents. But I could get into that if we need to, but I don't yet see a reason for thinking that. Cameron hasn't presented a strong enough argument for us to think that Protestants have to accept everything that the church authorities say, that the church fathers are infallible. He hasn't given us that reason yet.